My name is Hank Piper, and I'm a bookseller here at Labyrinth. I am pleased to welcome you all to tonight's event, which is a conversation between two veteran journalists, Alan Maimon and Joe Stevens, who will be discussing Maimon's new book, Twilight and Hazard, an Appalachian Reckoning, a work that combines long-term investigative reporting with a candid account of the impact the region has had on the recorder. In a moment, I will introduce the two speakers and the work they will be discussing, but first, a few housekeeping notes. Tonight's event is a hybrid event with both an in-store, socially distanced live audience and an online streaming component. A warm welcome to all of you here, and thank you for having and keeping your masks on. And to those of you who have joined online. Unfortunately, we have to wait a little bit longer to resume offering you refreshments at our in-store events. We will leave time for a Q&A, and we will bring the mic to those who wish to ask a question so that our guests can hear you through your masks. For those of you joining us online, I'd like to draw your attention to two buttons, the Ask a Question button and the Buy a Book button. These will allow you to participate alongside our live audience. If tonight's event leaves you yearning for similar conversations, look for future events under the Events tab at labyrinthbooks.com, or please consider signing up for our event newsletter. That being said, let me introduce tonight's speakers and say a few brief words about the wonderful book that is tonight's subject. Alan Maimon is an award-winning journalist whose work spans over 20 years of reportage and many areas of interest. He began his journalism career working in the Berlin bureau of the New York Times before accepting a job at the Eastern Kentucky bureau of the Louisville Courier-Journal. The 5 years he spent there provided the basis for Twilight and Hazard. During his tenure there, he was a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize in Public Service for reporting on Kentucky's troubled justice system. Since then, he has worked for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, where his work on police shootings and the courts met with national awards and acclaim. He is currently working as a staff investigator for the NJ-based Centurion Ministries, which works to vindicate and free the wrongfully convicted. He now lives locally with his wife, who I should note is a native of Eastern Kentucky, and his children in Hopewell. Joining him to discuss his new book is Joe Stevens, an acclaimed journalist in his own right, who is a 3-time winner of the George Polk Award and 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Currently, he is the director of Princeton University's program in journalism and the Ferris Professor of Journalism in Residence. Together, they will tackle the importance of Appalachia in our world today. Appalachia is a place far too often reduced to cliche or ignored except for moments of turmoil like the 2016 election, when it becomes a convenient scapegoat for our nation's ills. But Twilight and Hazard rejects this tendency and pays homage to what makes American journalism a worthwhile vocation. The credo that when one cuts through the stereotype and slander of clickbait and does the deep, long-term work of listening to the most neglected people and places, we all have the opportunity to see both the potential and pitfalls of our country through the nuanced light of their everyday experience. Alan Maimon's enduring commitment to this long and deep work is evident in the ways that he returns to finish stories begun over 20 years ago. The stories he tells raise so many urgent questions. If coal is the enemy, what can we do for the coal miners left in the wake of a declining industry? If Eastern Kentucky's political violence leaves us appalled, what has to change about the bullying influence of entrenched interests that have long encouraged that violence? The list could go on. Perhaps the most powerful message of tonight's book is that the answer to these questions lies in our collective ability to engage Appalachians as fellow Americans and human beings who are caught in the knot of a poverty whose roots are systemic rather than self-imposed. I am so pleased we now get to hear from Alan and Joe. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. And thanks everybody for being here in person and online. And I am so excited to be here tonight with Alan. I'm excited because Twilight and Hazard's book I've been waiting for a long time, and I'm glad it's finally here. I spent a substantial amount of my young life in Eastern Kentucky. I think it holds a special place in my heart and in my head, and also in my sometimes only lightly suppressed Southern drawl, which might pop out here later tonight as we go along. I don't know. It comes up at the most interesting times. Both of my parents grew up in a small coal mining town in Eastern Kentucky in McCurry County. And my grandfather was a coal miner. He died of lung disease. And a large number of my cousins and uncles worked in the mines. It was the best work you could get down there, and sometimes seemed like the only work you could get down there in the past. My father, he decided, I think wisely, that he did not want to work underground on his knees in the dark, waiting for the roof to fall. But he had gone to a one-room schoolhouse and he didn't have a high school degree, so what do you do? So like a lot of people, including some of the people that Alan talks about in his book, he joined the diaspora and he headed north and crossed the Ohio River, where there was an industrial base and you could get a factory job, which is the only decent paying job you could get without a high school degree, and when you had a thick drawl, which they didn't like in Ohio that much, I don't think. But he never really left the hills and hollers. Most weekends, all holidays, all vacations, we loaded up the car and we went right back down to McCurry County and hung out with the kinfolk. And neither of my parents really felt part of Ohio, I think it's fair to say. And the day my father retired, he loaded up the car and they both moved right back down to McCurry County. And so there's a hold that those hills and hollers have on people. It's hard to get out of them our hills, I think it's fair to say. And it's a beautiful area. It's a great place for family. I was there as recently as July, hanging out, seeing how things have changed over the pandemic when I've been on the East Coast. And I have been waiting for years for a smart, insightful look at this part of the country, which really holds a special place, I think, in the national lore. And I've been waiting and waiting. And there has been a little rush of books in recent years, but I did not recognize those people in those books. And then I got a copy of Alan's book, and I recognize those people. I recognize my people in your book. So thank you for that. That's an accomplishment on its own. It's an overlooked and misunderstood part of the country. And your book avoids stereotypes and cliches and easy answers, and it kind of makes me wish I had my drawl back, which I just can't summon up on my own. I have to be around someone else with a drawl to make this work. You know this syndrome. You even write about this a little bit in the book. So anyway, that's enough about me. I want to hear about you in your book, and my real question is, how does a Philadelphia guy like you end up in Eastern Kentucky?
It's a great place to start, I think. First of all, thank you everybody for joining us tonight in person and from afar. And thank you, Joe, for moderating the conversation. I'm honored to have you with me tonight. As Hank mentioned in his very kind introductory remarks, prior to coming to Eastern Kentucky to work in the Louisville Courier-Journal's Hazard Bureau, I was working as a news assistant in the New York Times' Berlin, Germany bureau. And I had been living in German-speaking Europe since graduating from college. And around the time of Y2K, for no real particular reason, but I kind of got the itch and thought, you know what, I think it's time to go home. Well, home by this point was a bit of an abstract concept for me. I had grown up in the Philadelphia area. I had attended college in New England. But by the year 2000, my parents had moved from their lifelong home in Philadelphia out west. And so I didn't have a logical place to go back to. And on top of that, I kind of felt like what I wanted to do at this point was come back to the United States, but to a place that I didn't have much knowledge about. and one that would challenge me as a journalist as much as my experiences in Germany have challenged me. And as fate would have it, around the time that I was coming up with this somewhat nebulous idea, I saw a job posting on one of the journalism websites for this opening in the Hazard, Kentucky bureau of the Louisville Courier-Journal. Did a little research, found out that the Courier-Journal had a great history of public service journalism, and that the Hazard Bureau was something of a legendary bureau that had been occupied by a lot of very talented and accomplished reporters. So I applied for the job and subsequently got the job. And one of the interesting things that I was told before leaving Louisville and heading out to Hazard, and just to orientate everybody, this was a couple days before Christmas in the year 2000. So right around the time the last hanging chads were being counted down in Florida, and the election was being handed to George W. Bush, and these were the shortest, coldest days of the year. And I packed up the company car with a few things and made the 4-hour drive from Louisville out to Hazard, which would be my base for the next 5 years, covering approximately 30 counties in eastern Kentucky. This may seem like a lot, but keep in mind Kentucky has 120 counties total, more than any state except Nebraska, I want to say. So I was covering 30 counties, but what I was really covering were the core coal mining counties of southeastern Kentucky, places like Hazard, places like Harlan, places like Pikeville. That's how I made the, I think, very popular move that people tend to make from Berlin, Germany to Hazard.
Quite a journey. And now you're here. So even for people who aren't from Eastern Kentucky, who've never been to Eastern Kentucky, it holds a place in the popular mind, right? Hillbillies, moonshiners, bluegrass, NASCAR, the Dukes of Hazzard, which was in Georgia, but it's really in Kentucky, which is confusing. Also explained in your book. Shotgun culture, all these stereotypes of the hills and the hollows of Kentucky. Where do they come from, and why do they have a hold on the popular mind?
Well, the way people and places are depicted in popular culture and in mass media go a very long way towards cementing a certain mindset about people and places. So all of the things that you mentioned certainly would be, if it were that game show, the Family Feud, where top 5 answers on the board, something you associate with Appalachian Kentucky, yes, those would be the top 5 answers probably. Well, one thing that was very interesting to me was something that my first editor at the Courier-Journal told me before departing for Eastern Kentucky. He said, "We want you to cover the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky as if you were a foreign correspondent."
Wow.
I'm working for a newspaper that's 4 hours away from Hazard, and I'm being told to cover it like a foreign correspondent. At the time, that made all the sense in the world to me. That's kind of what I was looking for at that point. It was only over the course of time that I realized this place is anything but a foreign place. This is one of the most American of places. And while I'm not going to say that everything you think about Appalachian Kentucky or Central Appalachia as a whole is wrong, what I will say is that I hope that what I've written will give you a much broader, more nuanced understanding of some of these phenomena.
And you do a great job of that. So I know you don't dwell on this in the book, but just to get the context and get it all the way for the rest of the conversation, could we talk about the demographics, the income level, the average longevity, the education level, all these things which are focused on a lot, and a lot of the kind of parachute journalism that's done. I think it's important for the broader conversation to acknowledge what's going on there and what's not going on.
Right, that's ground we have to cover, and I don't belabor any of these points in the book, but it's certainly something that one needs to understand about this area. And if there's a fairly pithy way of summarizing it, which is not only does Eastern Kentucky when it comes to almost every socioeconomic measurement lag behind the rest of the country, Eastern Kentucky also lags behind almost all of the rest of Central Appalachia. So we're talking about Central Appalachia at its most extreme when we're talking about the approximately 500,000 people who inhabit these counties in Eastern Kentucky that I covered.
So income, it's way down there.
You name your measurement: life expectancy, per capita income, higher education attainment, cancer rates, obesity rates, just everything that we look at when we determine whether a society is healthy or not in an overall sense.
Right. And yet people are really rooted down there. They don't want to leave for the most part. They like the life down there. And it's just got a real sense of place.
And there's a lot to like about it. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book and really shine a spotlight on this area is the goal remains, especially in a post-coal world down there, to create communities where outsiders will want to visit, companies will want to locate, and young people will want to stay and possibly start businesses, or at least and have a real compelling reason to stay. It is a very special place. And I have great affection for it, while at the same time feeling a lot of frustration towards some of the systems and the structures that I write about in the book that I feel have created a situation there where the area has been institutionally neglected in many ways, and it's very sad.
Yeah. So you mentioned a word there, coal. Let's just hit it head on. What role has coal played in the history of that region? And what's the situation now? And what role does coal play or not play in the future?
You might think that the history of coal mining in Eastern Kentucky goes back further than it actually does. The first seam of coal in Eastern Kentucky was mined in 1900. So yeah, so we're talking about an 120-year history of coal. Before coal, timber was the primary industry in Eastern Kentucky. The advent of the railroad really helped with coal getting off the ground. When I was in Eastern Kentucky from 2000 to early 2006, coal was actually experiencing a little bit of a boom, what's called a mini boom. And in some ways, that was the worst possible thing that could have happened at that time, because it led to complacency. I did countless stories on discussions about economic diversification in the area, and just felt that the will wasn't there because coal was doing okay at the time, and the coal industry had a lot of clout, let's just say. Around the time that I got there, the coal industry did something that was pure genius. They created a movement. They would call it a grassroots movement. Others might call it an AstroTurf movement called Friends of Coal. Friends of Coal. And it rallied people in the region around the industry. Coal keeps the lights on was the big bumper sticker, and coal puts food on the table, and coal pays a good wage. And guess what? Coal did, for that area especially, coal paid a very good wage. So they sponsored Little League teams, and they still sponsor the Marshall. There's an annual college football game between Marshall and I believe it's West Virginia University. Friends of Coal sponsors that game. Car shows, concerts, to win the hearts and minds of the local population, and I think it works to a large extent. Where we are today is a place where it should be fairly well accepted that coal is not coming back. And to the area's credit, I think there are some very smart people with vision thinking about what comes next. So, and that's one of the major, I think, questions that the book poses is, okay, what happens now? The 120-year history of coal is winding down. What's next?
Yeah, when I was growing up, coal paid very well. and lots of people wanted to work. I tried to arrange working one summer in college in coal mines. My mom said about pop. She did not want the cycle continuing, and a wildcat strike broke out, and so I wasn't able to work in the mines. But the money was good, and I think I was also somewhat attracted by the mystique of coal mining at that age. Maybe didn't realize what I was getting into. It was tough work, and still is tough work. I don't think you really mine in McCurry County anymore. Yeah, it played a big role down there. The mines have gone away for the most part, I think, and Stearns is the town where my family came from. And then there's a big push for recreation, to tourists in. It is a beautiful area. And then Supermax Prison popped up, and that provided a lot of jobs down there. So it's been this interesting evolution. But coal in Kentucky is not just money and jobs, it's politics. And you go pretty deep into that. How does the politics play out with coal?
I mean, it's politics, it's culture, it's heritage, it's identity, it's all of these things. Local school boards, county fiscal courts, coal. Coal traditionally has been the entity that let's just say has strong influence over all of these local entities. Then you have culture, heritage, and identity, which cannot be discounted in terms of the transition away from coal, because I think it's really important to recognize those things as important. I don't think it was I think it was a little tone deaf for a certain politician to say in 2016, we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work. Okay, I get the sentiment, and she did go on to elaborate in a way that, but boy, did she hand over a soundbite for the ages on that one, and it hurt people. It hurt people to their core, because this is such a part of who people are in Eastern Kentucky. My father-in-law worked in the mines for about 20 years, 25 years. He too died of black lung in 2003, but he, like many miners who I spoke to who had the disease, to a man, they all said, if I could do one thing before it would be to get back underground. I want to get back in the mines. That's how much a part of them it was. So as we talk about this transition away from coal, I think we need to be respectful of the culture, heritage, and identity of it, but also be brutally honest about the fact that it's time to move on.
Right. And I've heard a lot of stories. It's like people are proud of what they accomplished underground. They really are. Your book introduced me to a new term I had not heard over all these years: fly rock. Fly rock. And there was a little incident with Walmart too, I believe. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So fly rock is, okay, so there's underground mining and there is surface mining. And in recent years, especially, surface mining has the coal production from surface mining has far exceeded the production from underground mining. To extract coal from the hills, you need to blast the hills to get to the coal underneath the other rock. So what was happening while I was there, and is happening less now, mainly because there's just less surface mining happening now, is that companies would set off explosives that were way in excess of legal limits, causing huge pieces of boulder to fly off the side of the hill down onto property. I covered stories where boulders would crash through people's homes. By the grace of God, nobody was killed in any of the Kentucky incidents that I covered. There was a young boy in Virginia who was killed by a fly rock incident. And, you know, state regulators, they would hand out minimal fines to the companies who did this. Didn't really deter the companies from continuing this practice of blasting in excess of legal limits, until the fly rock chose the wrong target, which was a Walmart. I guess if the wrong target had been a Target, then that would have been even. But that got the attention. That got a boulder crashed through the roof of the Hazard Walmart, and the Hazard Walmart is the commercial center of Hazard, and so this led to a tightening of regulations when it came to fly rock. But yeah, really, that was something that one of those type of stories that covering it once, I thought, okay, this is covering it 2 times, 3 times, 5 times. Yeah. It was one of those stories that really had me scratching my head.
Yeah, the whole idea is fascinating. It's also just a great term, fly rock. So, to talk in broad generalities, give me a little wiggle room here. In my mind, and from my experience, the people of Eastern Kentucky tend to be quite devout, quite religious. Many of them are not affluent. They tend to see themselves as plain folk and are proud of that. They tend to judge people who put on airs. They judge people, as my father would say, get above the raisin. How is it then that they have come to vote in substantial numbers for a certain fancy, fast-talking millionaire?
Okay, we'll unpack this a little bit.
Just the way to
It's a little complicated, but let's start by establishing the baseline, which is in 2004, when I was in Eastern Kentucky, that was the last time that any of the coal counties of Eastern Kentucky voted Democrat in the presidential election. So for John Kerry, a few Eastern Kentucky counties went for John Kerry in 2004. Since then, 08, 12, so prior to Donald Trump, John McCain and Mitt Romney received almost as high a percentage of the vote in the presidential election as Donald Trump did in both 16 and 20. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book? I wouldn't maybe go that far, but one of the things that has always blown my mind is the result of the 2008 Democratic primary in Eastern Kentucky. This was Barack Obama against Hillary Clinton. The Kentucky primary is late in the primary calendar, so Barack Obama had the nomination almost sewn up by the time Kentucky's primary rolled around. However, in most Eastern Kentucky counties, Hillary Clinton got 90% of the vote against Barack Obama. The same Hillary Clinton, who 8 years later got 10% of the vote against Donald Trump. So this speaks to a very complicated dynamic. Eastern Kentucky used to love the Clintons, and they fell out of love with the Clintons. That's part of the reason that Hillary Clinton trounced Barack Obama and got trounced by Donald Trump. But there are other more pernicious forces at play with that as well. So circling back to Donald Trump in 16 and 20, Donald Trump got the same support in Eastern Kentucky in 20 as he got in 16. So he didn't lose any support in 20, even though the coal jobs that he promised didn't come back, didn't materialize. So why is that? There are various reasons for that. The bluster, the toxic masculinity part of it, I think resonates with a lot of people in the region. The frustration, like no politician has ever helped us. We might as well go for this guy out of left field. The reporters who flocked to Eastern Kentucky in 2016 after Donald Trump was elected president, I think badly whiffed on trying to figure out what had happened, and instead produced journalism that was in many ways very mean-spirited, just sticking it to the area. How could you have done this type of reporting, which I think was a missed opportunity in terms of just trying to get a broader understanding of the overall social dynamics of an area that would lead people to vote against their own financial interests. That's what it comes down to.
That's really fascinating. So in your ramblings, you also ran across a professional wrestler. This is on the same topic. A professional wrestler who called himself the progressive liberal, was it?
Yeah.
Could you describe this guy for us? Well, what's up with that?
Sure. And I'll add to the previous answer that Friends of Coal, which I mentioned earlier, also had a lot of influence when it came to shaping hearts and minds and voting habits as it pertains to Donald Trump. The progressive liberal. I grew up, I loved wrestling, professional wrestling when I was growing up. So when I heard about this guy called the progressive liberal, I just thought it was fantastic. And if you have even a passing familiarity with how professional wrestling works, in addition to it not being, real, sorry. I see some people who are shocked by that. The wrestlers are kind of divided up into two camps. There are the good guy wrestlers and the heels. The heels are when I was growing up, it was the Nikolai Volkov from the Soviet Union and the Iron Sheik from Tehran, Iran, and these were the wrestlers that everybody liked to boo and hiss at. Well, the perfect heel for a little minor league wrestling circuit in Eastern Kentucky in the year 2016 was the progressive liberal. And I talked, and what I found interesting about the progressive liberal, Daniel Hornsberger is his real name, is he is a progressive liberal in real life. He really is one, and so he fully embraced the character that he was playing, and he would wear like a airbrushed T-shirt with pictures of Hillary Clinton on it, and people ate it up. They came after this guy. He would wrestle on ball fields in the middle of rural Eastern Kentucky, and I just think it really spoke to our times that when I was growing up watching wrestling, it was the Russian and the Iranian, and now suddenly the big heel is the progressive liberal. It just speaks to something bigger.
Did he ever win?
I asked him that, and no. I asked what his record was, and you could tell by his answer that as the heel that people paid admission to watch him lose. So yeah, he was. I think he wasn't very forthcoming with his record, but no, he was getting pinned all the time by the conservative Republican wrestler.
Maybe a few years down the road, who knows? Maybe he'll have a comeback.
Well, one thing he would do is he would, before the bout started, he would, and he was taking his life in his own hands. He would really get, he would talk about green jobs, first of all, but then he would really get quite insulting towards the people about their coal heritage, and that's one thing you don't want to mess with, especially when you're wrestling in the middle of a makeshift ring in the middle of a soccer field where there's no security whatsoever, and probably quite a few people packing. So, but he said, everybody understood that it was in good fun, and he now has his real estate license. So I think he realized that
the realtor. That's another good wrestling. So, in addition to tackling all these weighty subjects, your book is also, it's got a bit of true crime in here too. You ran into a whole string of bad sheriffs. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. Among the criminally minded, there is no position that is more sought after in southeastern Kentucky than that of the position of county sheriff. If you're county sheriff, you run the show. And so we haven't talked about the opioid epidemic, but my bags had hardly been unpacked when I arrived in Hazard, when the U.S. Attorney's Office in Lexington, Kentucky put out a press release about a big announcement that was taking place the next day. That turned out to be the first public announcement that I know of anywhere about the drug OxyContin and about what it was doing to communities in Eastern Kentucky. So The political violence that I witnessed in 2002 was a direct offshoot of the opioid epidemic. Eastern Kentucky did not have a full-fledged economy, so this shadow economy had developed around illicit drugs. And boy, did the position of county sheriff become that much more important to people. So in two counties, in Harlan County, Kentucky, there was a guy named Paul Browning who had been sheriff in Harlan County back in the 80s, but then was sent to prison because he had ordered a hit on a couple of his political opponents. He got his civil rights restored and was in a position to make another run for the sheriff's office in 2002. And a lot of people embraced him. And in some ways, he was, he had kind of a Donald Trump quality to him, just a real bluster that appealed to a lot of people. Well, one day he came home late for, he never missed a University of Kentucky basketball game. And in March of 2002, UK was in March Madness, and he didn't come home that night. And his wife and his son were very concerned, knowing that he never missed a game. Well, the next day they found his burned body in the back of a pickup truck, and he had been shot in the head. And this was directly connected to this hotly contested race for sheriff in Harlan County. 2 weeks later, in Pulaski County, Kentucky, to the south of Harlan, the incumbent sheriff was appearing at a fish fry political fundraiser when a sniper in the hills shot him in the head. One shot, lethal. And as they unraveled that plot, they found that the shooter was an opioid addict, and his co-conspirators were, one of them was running for sheriff and thought he would take out his competition, and the third was the local drug kingpin. So fortunately, since 2002, we haven't seen violence of that magnitude, but it really speaks to what was happening at the very peak of the OxyContin epidemic and the fallout that we, to a lesser extent, continue to see.
So I want to get to questions, or to Q&A, but one last question for you. You mentioned opioids, and I think it's fair to say the opioids hit Eastern Kentucky a lot harder and earlier than most parts of the country, and there's been so much pain and suffering across the country, but it was special in Eastern Kentucky. Why do you think that was?
Well, it was an absolute American tragedy, and it was the result of institutional neglect, as are so many other things that have happened in that area. In a lot of ways, the area across the board has been seen as expendable. So when a drug company came out with a supposed wonder drug that was to treat chronic pain, people suffering from late stage cancer, it somehow got so heavily marketed, not somehow, it strategically got heavily marketed in places like rural Maine and rural Kentucky, to where doctors were prescribing it for mild back pain, for toothaches. Next thing you know, the streets are saturated with diverted pharmaceutical drugs. Prescription painkillers had always been an issue in that part of the country, but not like OxyContin, not as deadly as OxyContin. So by the time authorities started paying attention to this epidemic, it was too late. And even after they started paying attention to this epidemic, they continued to make marijuana enforcement a higher priority than OxyContin. And so, yeah, now no treatment facilities to speak of in the area at that time. One thing I've noticed is that there's a better infrastructure for that now. But back then, people didn't have a place to go for help. And it snowballed, and it affected literally every family in that area. It didn't leave anybody untouched.
No, it was horrible. It was horrible. I'm sure there's some questions out in the audience. We've covered a lot of
Can
ground.
I take your mic and you
You
guys
can.
can share?
Yep.
And we'll start right here.
Joe, do you happen to know what drew your ancestors to that area? And two, what in your upbringing drew you elsewhere?
You can share
No,
out.
no, we got
I don't have a ready answer for that, Jim. I don't really know what first drew them there. It's like, they've always been there as a sense. They've always been up the hills.
But before coal, what was there?
Well, before coal, there was timbering. And as a matter of fact, Stearns, it's named after the Stearns Company. It was a timber company. And they built a railroad into the county, and then they cut trees. And they sent it out on the railroad. And then at some point, they realized there was coal too. And it was the classic story. People came in on the railroad, they would cut timber, they would lay railroad lines, and then later they would dig coal, and they were paid in company script, not in money. And when I was growing up, there was the commercial center. I'm sure you've seen this a lot in Kentucky. Commercial center of the town was one building. It was segregated into 4 or 5 different businesses, and the names of these businesses literally were Store 1, Store 2, Store 3, and Store 4. And I can't remember how they hook up, but like Store 1 would be a grocery, Store 2 would be a drugstore, but they didn't even bother to give them the names. The houses were all identical. They were all painted the same color on the hills. And you paid for your groceries and your medicines and your rent with the company script, which I've still got some of this. And I don't know what it's worth now. And then if you wanted to get out, my understanding was originally the only way out was on the railroad, which was owned by the Stearns Company. And so you probably know more about how this all fits together, but once you were there, it sounds like it was really tough to get out. So why did I end up getting out? Well, it was because of my parents. My parents, they did not want to live a coal mining life. So they went to the nearest place they could go, which was suburban rural, ex-urban Cincinnati, Ohio, and a lot of hillbillies went there. And I say hillbillies because that's not a pejorative term down there. They take great pride in that. And so there was this whole, and this is also in Alan's book, there were large communities of transplants from coal country in rural Ohio. And you could work in the factories that were bustling and they paid a good wage and you could live a good life back then. And I think I led a different life very much than if I had grown up down there. I mean, I didn't really grow up down there. I feel more attached to that than to the Midwest, but in a lot of ways, but I didn't really live there. And as such, my sister was the first person I knew who went to college. I never met a person who went to college growing up. And my sister wanted to go, and it caused a fight in the family because she was a girl. Why would a girl go to college? And my parents did not want me to go to college. They intervened at one point and said, why would you do that? But that was the best motivation I could ever have.
If you want to give that back to here and then over there, and then there's a question online we'll get to.
You said that you were sent there to be treated as a foreign correspondent or treated as a foreign country. How were you, I know at least there's one person that took to you when you were there, but in general, were you treated as the foreigner or somebody who was an advocate for them in terms of what they saw in the Lexington paper?
It was a little of both. However, one of the things that made the greatest impression on me very quickly after coming to Hazard and traveling around a bit was how frequently people told me, right in the middle of a unrelated conversation, they would kind of interrupt the conversation and say, "You talk proper." And I heard this, I couldn't believe how many times I was hearing this. I lived in Germany. I was speaking German on nobody really commented on how I spoke. And now here I am back home, and people are just commenting right and left about how I speak. And so I actually ended up writing a story about that, about how important dialect is to the area. It's a very unique dialect. But unfortunately, there were people who felt like their job opportunities, educational opportunities would be limited if they spoke that way, and were paying good money to unlearn how to speak. Joe, I gotta hand the mic to Joe at this point.
What?
About your experiences.
With the draw?
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, I remember quite well being on the playground. And so you need to understand the geography. The Ohio River, at least to the Ohio line, was a hard line between the South and the North. And they wanted to keep that hard line, I think. This is all hindsight. And I had, like my whole family, a thick draw. And you could get beat up on the playground if you had a draw. And so I remember working very hard to lose it. And I did, I think. But no, it's like, and I'm half kidding, but it's like, I wish I had it back. But it's like, it was, if you wanted to fit in, you didn't want to be the outlier. You had to lose the draw.
Which I think is somewhat tragic. It's such an important part of identity and culture. But to circle back to your question, I mean, I think it's really important to note that Eastern Kentucky, like everywhere else, has its sinners, it has its saints, it has its nice people, it has its not nice people. So the reception I got varied greatly. Some people were really happy to have a watchdog reporter in the area looking out for their interests. Other people weren't, for whatever reason. So the longer I spent there, and through my marriage now to an 8th generation Appalachian, I think maybe that has helped me kind of navigate some things that I might not otherwise have been able to navigate. But by and large, okay, the only time I was ordered off somebody's property during my time as a reporter there was when I was doing a fly rock story. A piece of fly rock crashed through this guy's house. I thought he would be really eager to talk to me about how he didn't want to have anything to do with me, because probably his brother or his cousin or his uncle or somebody worked for that pulp company.
Okay, we have a question here and then a question online.
Thank you. I can't tell you how ironic it is that this get-together is occurring today, because, like, first of all, for a number of years I was trying to move out of Princeton to a college town in Appalachia, and for like 45 years I was trying to visit Eastern Kentucky, and I finally fulfilled my dream last week. And as a matter of fact, while I was in Hazard, I just missed being hit at a traffic light when she ran the traffic light, and this is my trip check from AAA. So I had a pleasant time talking to people, but I couldn't spit out the deep thought questions that I really wanted to have answers to, like you would ask them. But I guess the overriding question to me is, like, you use the phrase Appalachian Reckoning in the title of your book, and there's another book that I just got last year in Frostburg, Maryland, the whole title, it's called Appalachian Reckoning. Isn't that infringement or something?
You're referring to a book called Appalachian Reckoning, a Region Responds to Hillbilly Elegy?
Yes.
Yeah, my book is called Twilight and Hazard and Appalachian Reckoning. So I guess there's room at the table for multiple reckonings, and especially in the year that my book was published, because we heard that word. How many times have you heard that word recently? And it kind of concerns me that we use that word as a word to make ourselves maybe feel better, that we're actually thinking about change. And I address this in the book. I think that a reckoning really with any number of our issues in this country has to be a true reimagining And only then will we be having a true reckoning. But yeah, the similarities in title in between those books, I hope it doesn't bother people too much.
I'm gonna pass the mic to my colleague here to, for a question from our online audience.
This one kind of goes back to what you were saying about white people, asking white people would vote for Donald Trump, even though he has potentially failed promises. On a more local level, do you see the same types of thing happens? They mentioned West Virginia politician Joe Manchin being reelected despite many allegations.
Yeah, Kentucky's Senate delegation has been reliably Republican for quite a while. I do write in my book about a very interesting Senate race in 2004 in which a doctor from Hazard representing the Democratic Party came within a whisker of beating Jim Bunning, the then incumbent senator. And I sort of think about how things might have been different in Kentucky if there had been a Democratic voice in Washington out of Kentucky. The congressman who represents Eastern Kentucky is a 21st term congressman, Republican congressman named Hal Rogers. We all know Mitch McConnell as the senior senator from Kentucky, and Rand Paul as the other senator. So yeah, that if yes, okay. So hypothetically speaking, if we had a Democratic senator from Kentucky, there might be some Manchin-esque maneuverings for that person because their political life would depend on it. But we don't have that issue in Kentucky because the senators are both Republican.
I'll come to you.
Thank you guys for being here, and amazing book. 2 points I wanted to ask you about, which is sort of resonated with me. One specifically, which is a term I had never heard before, bad nerves. And then secondly, and I don't want to ruin anything for anyone who's not read it, but I think you gave such an incredibly thoughtful discussion about the death of local news and reporting, which just makes me want to cry already. Do you think that, how do I put this way, do you think this was a precursor to what we have just experienced in the last 4 or 5 years of sort of the unexposed, unknowing parts of local news that we don't have any more access to? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll give an answer to the second part and then maybe hand the mic to Joe. The years that I was in Eastern Kentucky were a particularly fraught time for journalism because this was really the time in which the internet was coming into its own and how newspapers were viewing it as an existential threat and felt like they needed to scramble to find ways to keep themselves relevant in the face of losing advertising revenue, which is what sustains print newspapers, is the malls and the car dealerships. How do you compete with the internet? Unfortunately, people at many major newspaper companies who were in a position to make big decisions at the time did so in sort of a short-sighted fashion. And I found myself caught in the middle of it towards the end of my time in Eastern Kentucky, where I was basically being asked to chase what we now know as clickbait. Instead of doing really in-depth, long-form journalism, just, you know, we got to get people to gravitate online by whatever means necessary. And a 3,000-word story about a corrupt fiscal court isn't going to get as many clicks as a 400-word story about something salacious and petty. So that was something that I experienced firsthand. And I just think those years 2000 to 2010 represent one period, and then maybe 2010 to now. Not that the challenges are gone, but things have maybe settled down just a bit in terms of newspapers understanding how they can still be vital and relevant. And maybe I'll let Joe address that a little bit.
Yeah. So what's happened in Eastern Kentucky, as I understand it, as I've learned in Alan's book, is similar to what's going on across the country. And the U.S. has this history. No other country, I think it's fair to say, has this history tradition of having this nervous system of these tiny, medium-sized and regional newspapers all across the country. And we've got a big geographic country. And this is how we know what's going on. This is how people make their views surface in the past. And if a new thing happens, like the opioid crisis starts in Eastern Kentucky, and there's no Alan there to report on it, we just don't know about it. And so problems can build and fester and explode eventually, potentially. And all these regional and local newspapers, they are going away. I almost feel like now saying they're gone. And it's almost like we're beyond recovery. And thank God for the journalists out there who are still plugging away. A lot of the papers that remain are owned by trust funds who don't have a public service mission. It's dire. And things are changing, new things are coming up, and I talk a lot to my students about the opportunities, and there's very cool things like epidemica, vertical nonprofits like the Marshall Project, lots of cool stuff. But the fact is, the surviving journalists are overwhelmingly between New York and DC in the Amtrak corridor. How do we know what's going on in Kentucky? How do we know what's going on in Iowa? How do we know what's going on in Wyoming? The fact is, we don't. It's going away. And there's more to read now through social media and so on than ever, but that's not journalism. It's not verified. We don't know what's true. It's desperate, and I talk about this a lot. And I hope someone, maybe Alan, figures this out.
Yeah, it's worth adding that I was the last Eastern Kentucky reporter for the Courier-Journal. They closed the bureau. That's why I left. They closed all the state bureaus except for the one in Frankfurt, the state capital bureau. And they haven't. So for the past 15 years, there's been no permanent reporter in Eastern Kentucky. And yeah, this is a trend that we've seen in other papers like the Courier-Journal, just focusing on a particular metro area at the expense of what some really important things that are going on in other parts of the state.
So all of this context makes your book that much more precious. And so thank you for writing it. Thanks to both of you for coming to speak about it to us. This has been wonderful. And thank you all for coming out. Having you in our space, back in our space, is really an amazing marker for us at Labyrinth. And so means a lot. And if you want to get a signed copy of Twilight and Hazard, what a name for a town, right? And,
After I was nearly killed by the driver, I felt that's why they called it.
yeah. Can I ask you, Alan, to go to our counter in the back and sign some copies, and then you can pay for it there. And then I will, in the meantime, go upstairs and let folks out who want to leave. But please join me in a round of applause because we can.
I don't want to leave it on a complete downer. I think there is a bright future possible in Eastern Kentucky. It will be a jigsaw puzzle of different things that will lead to that. A little bit of tourism, arts, ag, manufacturing, that with enough smart people at the table to talk about how to diversify the economy and to make those conversations urgent like they should have been 15 or 20 years ago, I think some really good things can happen in Eastern Kentucky. And anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to visit the region, I would suggest that you do it. It's beautiful and it's not like any place else, which is kind of cool.